A new type of food was created in laboratories. It was gradually introduced into supermarkets and pantries. Its effects on human health took decades to surface. This was not an isolated event. This wasn't a sudden change. It was a process that unfolded across generations, beginning in the early 20th century when food production shifted from something local and seasonal to something industrial and permanent. The language used to describe this shift was always optimistic: modernization, efficiency, progress. What it meant in practice was that food began to be designed in ways that had never existed before. At the time, this was considered normal. The first significant changes came through processing techniques that extended shelf life. Flour was stripped of its germ and bran to prevent spoilage. Oils were hydrogenated to remain solid at room temperature. Milk was pasteurized and homogenized to create uniformity. Each of these modifications solved a logistical problem. Each one also removed something that had been present in food for thousands of years. The reasons given were always practical. Food needed to travel farther. It needed to last longer. It needed to be affordable for more people. These were reasonable goals, and the methods used to achieve them were presented as straightforward improvements. There was little discussion about what might be lost in the process or whether the changes might have effects that wouldn't be visible for decades. Most people didn't question it. The modifications became more complex as the century progressed. Synthetic vitamins were added back into processed foods to replace the nutrients that had been removed. This was called fortification, and it was framed as a public health measure. White bread, which had been stripped of nearly everything that made wheat nutritious, was now fortified with isolated B vitamins and iron. The assumption was that these additions would function the same way as the original nutrients had within the whole grain. No long-term studies were conducted to verify this assumption. The same pattern repeated across dozens of food categories. Margarine replaced butter, presented as a heart-healthy alternative based on the theory that saturated fat caused heart disease, a theory that was never as settled as the public was led to believe. Breakfast cereals, invented as health foods, became vehicles for sugar and synthetic nutrients. Infant formula was marketed as scientifically superior to breast milk, despite the fact that breast milk contained thousands of compounds that formula could not replicate. Each product was introduced with the backing of scientific authority. Each one blended into everyday life without sustained scrutiny. What made this process possible was trust. People trusted that the institutions regulating food were acting in their best interest. They trusted that scientists working for food companies were conducting rigorous safety tests. They trusted that if something was sold in stores, it had been proven safe for long-term consumption. This trust wasn't irrational. It was built on the genuine successes of the early 20th century. The elimination of certain deficiency diseases, the reduction of foodborne illness through pasteurization, the expansion of food access through industrial agriculture. These were real achievements, and they created a foundation of credibility that allowed more questionable changes to proceed without resistance. By the 1950s and 1960s, the transformation was accelerating. Convenience became a primary value in food marketing. TV dinners, instant mashed potatoes, powdered orange juice, shelf-stable desserts. Each product represented a further step away from food that required preparation or spoiled quickly. The message was clear. Modern life was too busy for the old ways. Food needed to adapt to the pace of progress. Most people never noticed this at the time. The ingredients lists grew longer. Substances that had never been part of human diets began appearing regularly. Emulsifiers, stabilizers, preservatives, artificial colors, artificial flavors. Each one had been tested individually and deemed safe in the quantities used. What hadn't been tested was the cumulative effect of consuming dozens of these substances daily across an entire lifetime, starting from infancy. The regulatory framework assumed that if something didn't cause immediate harm, it was safe. This was a reasonable assumption for acute toxins. It was a deeply flawed assumption for substances that might affect development, metabolism, or gut function over years or decades. No one was tracking the long-term patterns. The real shift came with the introduction of high-fructose corn syrup in the 1970s. This wasn't just another ingredient, it was a structural change in the economics of food production. Corn syrup was cheaper than sugar, and government subsidies made it cheaper still. Within a decade, it had replaced sugar in most processed foods and beverages. The quantities used increased dramatically because cost was no longer a limiting factor. At the same time, fat was being removed from products in response to public health campaigns against dietary fat. When fat was removed, taste was lost. To compensate, sugar was added. Products that had once been savory became sweet. Products that had always been sweet became sweeter. The human palate was being recalibrated on a population-wide scale, and it happened gradually enough that most people didn't register the change as it occurred. Children born in the 1980s grew up in a food environment that was fundamentally different from the one their grandparents had known. Their baseline for normal taste, normal sweetness, normal texture was shaped by foods that had been engineered in laboratories. They had no reference point for comparison. By the 1990s, serving sizes had begun to expand. What had once been considered a single portion was now labeled as 2 or 3 servings, but marketed and sold as a single unit. The human body's natural satiety signals, which had evolved over millions of years to regulate intake of whole foods, were not equipped to handle energy-dense, nutrient-poor, highly palatable processed foods in increasing quantities. The food industry's own internal research showed that certain combinations of sugar, salt, and fat could override satiety signals and drive continued consumption. This research was used to optimize products for what the industry called snackability and craveability. The goal was not to nourish, it was to maximize consumption. This wasn't discussed openly. The real impact appeared years later. By the early 2000s, obesity rates had tripled since the 1970s. Type 2 diabetes, once called adult-onset diabetes, was now being diagnosed in children. Rates of metabolic syndrome, fatty liver disease, and autoimmune conditions were rising in patterns that couldn't be explained by genetics alone. The timeline matched. The changes in food production and the changes in public health were occurring in parallel. The populations most affected were those with the greatest exposure to processed foods, particularly low-income communities where fresh whole foods were less accessible and where food marketing was most intensive. By the time consequences were visible, habits were already set. The response from institutions was fragmented and slow. Dietary guidelines continued to emphasize personal responsibility and portion control, as if the primary problem was individual willpower rather than a systematically altered food supply. Food companies introduced healthier versions of their products, reduced fat, reduced sugar, fortified with fiber, but the fundamental structure of industrial food production remained unchanged. The most significant changes were cosmetic. Packaging became more sophisticated. Marketing became more carefully calibrated to parental concerns. Products that were fundamentally similar to their predecessors were rebranded as natural, wholesome, or health-conscious. The word natural appeared on foods containing dozens of processed ingredients. The word whole grain appeared on cereals that were still primarily sugar. Labels became tools of obfuscation rather than clarity. What made this system so resilient was that it wasn't organized as a conspiracy. It was the predictable outcome of converging incentives. Agricultural subsidies that made certain crops cheaper than others. Corporate structures that prioritized quarterly profits over long-term health outcomes. Regulatory agencies that relied on industry-funded research. Marketing budgets that dwarfed public health budgets, and a cultural narrative that framed convenience and low cost as unqualified goods. Each actor in the system could point to reasonable justifications for their decisions. Farmers grew the crops that subsidies supported. Food scientists formulated products that met the specifications given to them. Regulators approved ingredients that met the established safety standards. Marketers sold products using techniques that were legal and effective. No single decision-maker was responsible for the whole. This is what allowed the system to function without sustained opposition. The pattern was particularly clear in schools. The National School Lunch Program, created in 1946 to address childhood malnutrition, gradually shifted its focus from nutrition to cost efficiency. By the 1980s and 1990s, school cafeterias were serving pizza, chicken nuggets, and chocolate milk as regular staples. Vending machines filled with soda and candy appeared in hallways. Fast food franchises opened locations inside schools. Children were being taught, through daily repetition, that this was normal food. The justification was always funding. Schools needed revenue, and food service contracts provided it. Parents were busy, and kids preferred the processed options. It was framed as pragmatic, not ideal. But pragmatism, repeated over decades, becomes culture. By the 2010s, a significant portion of the population had lived their entire lives in this food environment. They had been formula-fed as infants, weaned onto jarred baby food with added sugars, raised on breakfast cereals and lunchboxes filled with individually wrapped snacks, educated in schools where soda machines stood next to water fountains. Their metabolic systems, their gut microbiomes, their taste preferences had all developed within a context that was historically unprecedented. What seemed too small to matter back then had compounded. The broader economic structure reinforced these patterns. Fresh produce required refrigeration and spoiled quickly, which made it expensive to transport and stock. Processed foods had none of these limitations. They could be shipped anywhere, stored indefinitely, and sold at margins that made them profitable even at very low prices. In food deserts, urban and rural areas with limited access to grocery stores, processed foods were often the only options available. This wasn't accidental. It was the logical outcome of an economic system that prioritized efficiency and scalability over every other consideration. The cultural narrative around food also shifted. Cooking became something people did for pleasure or special occasions, not out of necessity. The skills required to prepare whole foods, how to choose produce, how to cook grains, how to use basic seasonings, began to disappear from common knowledge. Convenience became so normalized that preparing food from scratch was seen as a hobby or a luxury, not a basic life skill. 2 generations passed this way. The cumulative effect was a population whose metabolic health was fundamentally different from that of their ancestors, not because of genetics. Genetics change over millennia, not decades, but because the inputs had changed. The human body, which had evolved to process whole foods in their natural state, was now processing substances that had been chemically altered in ways that had no evolutionary precedent. The consequences weren't uniform. Some people adapted better than others, likely due to genetic variations in how they metabolized specific compounds. But on a population level, the patterns were clear. The countries that industrialized their food systems earliest saw the health changes earliest. The populations within those countries that had the greatest exposure to processed foods saw the most dramatic shifts. This wasn't a mystery. The data was accumulating. What was missing was a willingness to act on it at a systemic level. The food industry's response to growing health concerns was to shift the narrative toward personal choice. Advertisements emphasized balance and moderation. Labels included calorie counts and serving sizes. The message was clear: if you consume these products responsibly, there's no problem. If health issues arise, it's because you failed to exercise self-control. This framing was strategic. It deflected attention away from the fact that these products had been engineered to be difficult to consume in moderation. It positioned the industry as providing options while placing all responsibility on the consumer. And it worked. Public health campaigns continued to focus on education and individual behavior change. There were efforts to improve food labeling, to restrict certain additives, to reduce marketing to children. These were valuable, but incremental. They didn't address the underlying structure: the subsidies that made corn syrup cheaper than fruit, the food deserts that made processed foods the only accessible option, the economic pressures that made convenience necessary rather than optional for working families. The system remained fundamentally unchanged. By the 2020s, the long-term effects were becoming impossible to ignore. Life expectancy in the United States had begun to decline, an extremely rare occurrence in developed nations during peacetime. Metabolic diseases were affecting younger populations. Mental health conditions, some of which had been linked to gut microbiome disruption and nutritional deficiencies, were rising sharply. The food environment was not the only factor, but it was a significant one. What had begun a century earlier as an effort to make food more abundant and affordable had resulted in a situation where food was everywhere, yet malnutrition in the form of nutrient deficiency amid caloric excess was widespread. People were overfed and undernourished simultaneously. The experiment had been running for 4 generations. No one had consented to it. No one had been told it was happening. It had emerged through a series of decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, made by people who believed they were solving problems, backed by institutions that were trusted to protect public welfare. The long-term consequences were now visible. The mechanisms were now understood. The question that remained was whether the system that had created this situation was capable of changing it, or whether the incentives were too entrenched, the profits too substantial, the cultural patterns too deeply established. This wasn't the only area where similar patterns had emerged. The same logic, prioritizing efficiency, convenience, and cost over long-term consequences, had been applied to sleep, to work, to medicine, to education. Each time, the changes were introduced gradually. Each time, they were framed as progress. Each time, the effects appeared slowly enough that they could be attributed to other causes. And similar decisions followed.